This evening we celebrate the passing of the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the 24th of the month of Teves. It is the day as well that my son was born on this auspicious day, and that's why we called him Shneur Zalman after the Alter Rebbe. So the 24th of Teves, a day of a Yortzeit, the day of a passing of a great tzaddik, is a day that Kol Amoloi Asher Amal Boi, all the work that he put into his life and all the Torah knowledge that he gathered and all the innovations that he made and all the mitzvos that he performed come together on this day. And Poyel Yeshua is Bekerev Haaretz, it brings about salvation and help and healing for the entire world. And so, in honor of Chav Dalet Teves, we will tell the story of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, once visited the city or the village of Hummel. And while he was there teaching and coaching the people of Hummel, a terrible fire broke out. The fire ravaged the entire community. House by house was being consumed and eaten by this fire. It was so bad that they called the army to put out the fire. And so the army came down to Hummel, and they did everything in their power to stop the fire. But the fire was bigger and more mighty than the army. A few chassidim approached the Alter Rebbe and said, Rebbe, we have a big problem here. Hummel is being consumed one after the other, and the army came down. They cannot save the city. Please do something. The Alter Rebbe went out of the house where he was. He walked over to this giant fire, and he simply stared at the fire. After a few seconds, a moment perhaps, all of a sudden the winds changed, and the fire began to go in the opposite direction. It began to reverse itself, to go back to the houses that already were burnt. And now the houses that were not burnt, that were untouched, Baruch Hashem, were saved. And very soon after, the fire was put out. This was such a clear miracle that the army themselves were blown away. The army themselves testified that there was a man that stood there and the fire stopped. The army went back to their general to tell them the story. The general of the army told his soldiers, go back to this great man and tell him that the general requests to have an audience with him. Would he allow me to see him? They came back to the Alter Rebbe and said, the general would like to see you. Can you see him? The Alter Rebbe said, I'm willing to see him. The general came to the Alter Rebbe. He came to Hummel and asked the Alter Rebbe the following question. Are you still alive? The Alter Rebbe responded, I am his spiritual grandson. That was the beginning and the end of the conversation. The general got up, said thank you, and he left. The chassidim that witnessed this audience went over to the general and said, General, what happened? What did you say? And what did the Alter Rebbe answer you? He said, let me say this. My father was a general in the army as well. And my father was deployed to different cities, and he was distant from my mother. My mother, he says, was pregnant, and my father knew that very soon she was supposed to give birth. But the country was at war at that time. It was very difficult to get any letters. And my father was beside himself. He was in a state of anxiety, full of consternation. He couldn't concentrate. He was so worried about my mother giving birth to a child. The soldiers went over to my father, and they said to him, you know, you are now in Mezhebush. In Mezhebush, there's a holy tzaddik. And his name is the Baal Shem Tov. He's a miracle worker. Get an audience with him and ask him what to do. And so he came to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said, if the general wants to see me, I am happy to see him. The general came to the Baal Shem Tov. He told the Baal Shem Tov the problem. Baal Shem Tov picked up a mirror and said, look inside the mirror. The general looks into the mirror and he sees no longer a mirror. And he sees himself flying over Mezhebush, flying over the other cities, and flying to his hometown and landing in the backyard of his house. And then he walks in and he sees the midwives talking. And they're saying, you know, that the general's wife just gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And after he sees this movie before his eyes, the mirror returns to the mirror. And now he sees once again his face. He turns to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov tells him, you are to know that your wife just gave birth to a healthy baby boy. In a few days you will get word from messengers that the baby is okay and your wife is okay. He was very grateful to the Baal Shem Tov, and he left. This general now turns to his chassidim and his soldiers and says, my dear chassidim, I was that baby that was born at that moment. And I knew the story from my father. And I knew that the Baal Shem Tov was a great miracle worker. And since then, I never heard of such a holy rabbi. When my soldiers came and told me that there was a rabbi that stood there and he changed the entire direction of the fire, I said to myself, I have to meet him. Perhaps he's the same rabbi that gave my father the insight that I was born. I needed to see him. And so I asked him, are you still alive? And he said, no, I am his spiritual grandson. I am the student of his student. I am the student of the Maggid of Mazrich, who is the student of the Baal Shem Tov. That is the story, my dear friends. And so this is the message today as we enter into Chav Dalet Tevis, the day of the passing of the Alter Rebbe. We have to say, are you still alive? Is the Rebbe still alive? And the answer is, Ma zari b'chayim afu b'chayim. If his children are alive, if you learn his teachings, if you go in his ways, yes, you are still alive. And so this is the message of all of us, that we need to learn more Torah, we need to learn Tanya, we need to do acts of goodness and kindness. And by doing so, we will see all the blessings. Uvahu ha'ovdim me'eretz Ashur, v'anidachim me'eretz Mitzrayim. How God will take us out of Ashur and out of Mitzrayim. V'yishtachevu l'Hashem b'har HaKodesh, and we will bow down to Him. B'Yerushalayim in Jerusalem, with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days.